as Dave said, I'm Lydia. I'm part of New Life Church, and it's my privilege to be sharing with you this morning. Oh, sorry, you don't hear my heavy breathing. Fabulous. Now, normally I would start with a nice sort of slow, gentle introduction to what we're going to talk about today, and kind of ease us in gently. But because of time, I think we're just going to jump straight in at the deep end. Is that okay? This is your official warning if you need to stretch, if you need to put a mint in, or whatever you do to stay awake during preaches. Not that I'm giving away any of my secrets, but yes, that's your official warning. We're just going to dive in with some big questions. Are you ready? Fab, let's go. So first thing is, I wonder, have you ever asked the question, where are you, God? Where are you, God? Where were you when that terrible thing happened? Where are you when I'm praying and I'm crying out and I just don't seem to hear an answer? Where are you, God, in the injustice, in the pain, in the heartbreak? Where are you, God, when things are just not what they're supposed to be? Maybe you're asking yourself that question this morning. Maybe you're facing job loss and financial struggles. Maybe you're dealing with a relationship breakdown. Maybe you're battling loneliness. Maybe you've just had an unwanted diagnosis for you or a loved one. Or maybe it's on this Remembrance Sunday when we turn our thoughts to the conflicts, past and present, that you just find yourself asking, where are you, God? You see, I wonder if whether you're here and you have a close personal relationship with God, or whether you're here and you think, is there even a God out there? I wonder if most of us, if not all of us, have asked that question before. I know I certainly have. Now, we're currently in a series exploring what it means to be a people of God's presence, how we can carry God's presence and carry it out around us. So how do we do that when we have all these unanswered questions? I did give you a warning, we were going to jump straight in, so I hope you're awake and ready this morning. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at a story in the Bible of two sisters who seem to be asking just that question, where are you, God? And this is a story of sisters called Martha and Mary. They have a brother, Lazarus. Lazarus is actually a personal friend of Jesus. In fact, the Bible tells us that Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And Lazarus is in a village called Bethany, and he actually falls ill, becomes really unwell. And that message goes to Jesus to tell him that Lazarus is unwell. The exact location of Jesus at this point is somewhat disputed, but it is agreed that he's probably across the River Jordan, about a day's journey away from Bethany. And Jesus doesn't come straight away. He stays where he is for a couple of days, and then he makes the journey to Bethany. So when he arrives, Lazarus is actually already dead and in a tomb for 4 days. And that's where we're going to pick up our reading today. So we're going to read from John, verse 11. If you don't have a Bible, it will come up behind me, but if you do, you might want to follow along. John chapter 11, verse 32. It says, now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Mary, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." That's a pretty epic story, I think, as far as stories go in the Bible, isn't it? We've literally got Lazarus being raised from the dead. Pretty amazing story. But if we go back to where we started this passage this morning, when Mary first sees Jesus, when he arrives after Lazarus has been dead, she says to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And if we rewind slightly, Mary's sister Martha also, when she first sees Jesus arriving in Bethany after the death of Lazarus, she says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Perhaps in other words, why weren't you here? Where were you, Jesus? Do you notice how real and raw these sisters are with Jesus? They don't feel the need to disguise their emotions and come with a packaged up speech and greet him with big long words of welcome and keep their requests for help dignified and controlled. No, they come to Jesus. Mary falls at his feet and pours out exactly what's on her heart in this moment. They are caught up in grief and they let the pain speak. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Where were you, Jesus? Now, these sisters, as we've said, they know Jesus personally. They're not being disrespectful to him. In fact, they both greet him by calling him Lord. They recognize who he is, his authority, his divinity. But actually, it's perhaps because they have this greater sense of intimacy with Jesus that they feel a greater freedom to just be open and honest with him. It is maybe precisely because Jesus is Lord to Mary and Martha that they feel so hurt and perplexed at that. Why wasn't he here? And I think this is important because I wonder if we can perhaps find it difficult to admit our pain in unanswered prayer, maybe our disappointment in God. Because perhaps we feel that if we let out a raw cry like that of Mary and Martha that says, "Where were you, God?" Well, maybe actually that somehow means we're lacking in faith or we're lacking in the belief of God's goodness. Well, Pete Craig, who's a Christian author and founder of a global prayer movement, he says this, he says it is this very conviction, the belief that prayer works, that causes perplexity and pain when it doesn't. Unanswered prayer is only a problem for those who believe. For others, it's simply a confirmation they were right all along. Even further than this, if we fast forward to Jesus himself, we see that he seems to ask this question, "Where are you, God?" You see, when Jesus is arguably at his most vulnerable, his time of greatest need, when he needs his Father the most, he is hanging on a cross near death and he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In other words, where are you, God? You see, Jesus understands what it feels like to feel forsaken and abandoned. So when, like Mary and Martha, you perhaps face huge grief, sudden trauma, broken dreams, it's okay to admit the pain and loss and disappointment to God. Jesus invites you, like he did Mary and Martha, to come to him real and raw and with unpolished emotions. It's okay to ask the question, "Where are you, God?" So how does Jesus respond? How does Jesus respond? Does he put his arm around Mary and say, there, Mary, I'm sorry"? Does he say, "It's all right, I've got a plan for Lazarus, it's okay"? No, we read verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So how does Jesus respond? He is deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. If we fast forward in verse 38, we read that he is deeply moved again. We read that twice. Now, the Greek word underlying that deeply moved is embrimaomai or embrimaomai. I'm probably saying that completely wrong, so apologies if there's any Greek scholars among us. I am not one. But that word means to feel something deeply and strongly. Jesus was moved with profound sorrow at the death of his friend Lazarus and at the grief around him. But that word, embrimaomai, or however you say it also means to be indignant or angry, translated almost like a groan or a snort. You see, here as well as sorrow, Jesus also appears to be expressing deep anger at the evil of death. He's outraged. He's somewhat enraged in the face of the grief presented in front of him. Why? Because it brings home the nature of the evil of death, its unnatural and violent character. It is death that is the object of Jesus' wrath, and behind death, the enemy who has the power of death and who Jesus came to destroy. There's a sense, if you like, of Jesus pointing at his friend Lazarus' death and the grief all around and saying, the enemy did this. So Jesus is deeply moved. And then we read in perhaps what is one of the shortest yet most powerful verses of the Bible, verse 35, Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Jesus does not stand stoic in the face of his own grief or the sister's grief or others. Rather, Jesus weeps. The Bible commentator Bruce Milne writes this. He says, Jesus is not remote from the sufferings of his fellow humans. The fact that he is one with us in humanity means that he is one with us in agony. Jesus' tears are not the professional tears of the hired mourner or the inwardly detached spectator. Jesus is one with us in our need. He feels our pain. He lives our experience from the inside. His tears at that moment authentically express the emotion of his heart. And again, I wonder if there's a releasing perhaps for some of us this morning, almost of a permission to feel deeply. The Bible gives us the word to lament, which means to passionately express grief or sorrow. It's what Jesus does in this story. He's deeply moved. He weeps. You see, it's not a sign of weakness. It's not embarrassing. It's not unmanly. It's not overly intense. It is a full part of being human, just as Jesus was fully human. It is a reality of living in a world today that is not as God had originally designed it to be. And in fact, the Jews who are watching on Jesus' response, they say, see how he loved him. He's a true friend. He weeps for Lazarus. Now, if I'm being completely honest with you guys, when I grew up, I wasn't, it was maybe a generational thing, who knows, but I wasn't encouraged to feel things deeply, to express emotions passionately, perhaps quite the opposite. And so I wonder if perhaps in a stiff upper lip culture where we like to keep calm and carry on, maybe for some of us this morning, we don't just need like a permission to be able to welcome and embrace and feel things deeply, but we actually need to ask God, how? How do I express them? How do I lament? How do I grieve as I go through life? How do I let out disappointment and sorrow and pain? I think really, really importantly, it's interesting to point out here in Lazarus' story that Jesus knows how the story ends. He knows that Lazarus will be raised from the dead. He understands God's kingdom and eternity. And yet he allows himself to weep in the face of death. Jesus weeps at the pain, the devastation, the loss. He knows that his friend Lazarus will breathe again, will get up, will walk out of that cave. He knows that. And yet he weeps. His mourning, his lamenting, his weeping, his outrage at the evil of death are real and true in this moment. Jesus isn't lacking faith. He knows of the coming resurrection of Lazarus. But he allows himself to weep at the evil of death. And so we too can allow ourselves to weep at the evil of death, even though we know of the hope that Jesus brings. And isn't this a beautiful demonstration from Jesus of how we can show compassion and empathy to others? Isn't it just so important that we don't rush people into, it's okay, it will all be okay in the end, it's okay, it will all be okay. That actually we can pause, like Jesus did with Mary and Martha. We can enter into the place of lament that people are in and hold that burden with them. That is part of what it means to carry God's presence, to be a people of God's presence. And I wonder if for some of us, we've maybe just never let ourselves encounter the God who weeps. You see, again, commentator Bruce Milne writes this. He says, we live in a world swept by great emotions: pity, anger, joy, hatred, desire, rage, love, grief, regret. At times, our personal world is invaded by these storms, lifting us to heights of ecstasy, or more often, plunging us into the depths of agony. In such moments, the familiar landmarks lose their power to direct us. We seem not even to know ourselves. But Jesus is there. He has been this way already. You see, when we are in the presence of God, we are in the presence of a God who knows, a God who cares, a God who is deeply moved, a God who weeps. And that's the presence we carry to others. That's the Jesus we introduce others to. Not some distant God, but a Jesus who feels their anger and outrage at the evil of death. A Jesus who meets them in the midst of their situation, their mess and pain, and weeps with them. So what happens next? Is that the end of the story? Well, the Jews who were present, they seem to be watching on Jesus' sorrow, a bit confused. Some of them are saying, well, could you not have stopped this from happening? Maybe Jesus' power does have a limit, and maybe this is it. Maybe he can deal with some trials, he can heal some sickness, but not all. So they're wondering, posing these questions. And Jesus then immediately proceeds to demonstrate how wrong they are and how wrong anyone has been over centuries to put a limit on his power. You see, Jesus commands Lazarus' tomb to be opened. And even Martha in this moment seems to struggle to muster up the faith. She says, well, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. And Jesus reminds her of his promise that all this would end in the glorifying of God. He says, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory? Jesus then prays, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. Jesus stands here in his Father's presence. His confidence comes from being constantly in the presence of his Father. Jesus confidently expresses thanks to his Father that he's heard him, that he always hears him. There's a real oneness between Jesus and his Father, a demonstration, if you like, of what it looks like to be constantly in God's presence, where Jesus has a trust so deeply rooted that he has no doubt of God's provision here. And then we read, verse 43, that Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips and his face wrapped with a cloth. I mean, that feels pretty exciting as a next step in this story. That clearly in this story, Lazarus' death and resurrection, it doesn't stop with death. Death doesn't get to win because the victory belongs to God. And we can see how this story anticipates the death and resurrection of Jesus himself. You see, for Mary and Martha, they call for urgent help for Jesus, and he doesn't seem to come. They experience waiting, longing, seemingly unanswered prayer, disappointment, loss, and death. And then finally, they see the victory when Jesus raises Lazarus back to life again. And if we look at Jesus' story, we've said earlier how he's hanging on that cross and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He too experiences waiting, longing, and seemingly unanswered plea for help. You see, God doesn't suddenly come down and say, it's all right, Jesus, we'll spare you the cross. No, there's nothing in that moment. Jesus does face death. And then the next day, his disciples, they live out the pain, the confusion, the loss, the disappointment over Jesus' death. But then Easter Sunday arrives. And Pete Greig writes in his book, God on Mute, he describes it by saying this. He says, finally, on Easter Sunday, God broke the silence. He awoke, he spoke. Easter Sunday gives great cause to hope that one ultimate miracle, the resurrection of the Son of God from the dead, assures us that every buried dream and dashed desire will ultimately be absorbed and resurrected into a reality far greater than anything we can currently imagine. Yeah. You see, Jesus' death and resurrection, they give us certainty of the promise that one day Jesus will return and there will be a new creation, new heaven and new earth. And those of us who know Jesus, who've chosen to give our life to Jesus, to put our hope and trust in him, we will be resurrected and given new life. And John actually shares in the last book of the Bible called Revelation, he shares a vision that he has of this new creation. And he writes in Revelation 21, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. Now, how's that for being a people of his presence? We will get to be with God himself. One day we will no longer be asking the question, where are you, God? Because we will be with him and see him face to face. He will personally wipe away every tear from our eye. You see, just as in Lazarus' story, death doesn't get to win. In Jesus' story, death doesn't get to win. In our story, death and suffering and pain and loss and heartbreak, they don't get to win because Jesus wins. And that changes everything for us here and now. When we carry this hope into the world, it arguably speaks louder than any other witness. You see, death is universal. Sooner or later, we all will experience the shock and sorrow of death. And Remembrance Sunday points us to this only too well. And from a human perspective, that's it. There's nothing left to say. But precisely in this moment is where the truths and hope of faith can radiate most vividly. Isn't it interesting that in his gospel, John doesn't record Lazarus' reaction to being raised from the dead or any of the aftermath, really? I don't know, I'd love to read what happens next, how Lazarus reacts and what happens, but we don't read that. Because the focus isn't actually on Lazarus in this story as much as it is on Jesus. This is Jesus' story more than it is Lazarus' story. And I just wonder, what if that were true of our lives? What if our lives were a story that point to Jesus more than they point to ourselves? What if that's partly what being a people of his presence leads to? Now we're going to come in to draw to a close very soon. But let me just say as we do, that as we live in this present world, as we await Jesus' return, there will be plenty testimonies of God's miraculous provision, his certain answer to prayer, his healing, and praise God for those. But there will also be Plenty testimonies of waiting, of longing, of pain, of disappointment and loss. And again, Remembrance Sunday points us to this. You see, we live in the now and not yet. Jesus has already won the victory, but we're not in a new creation yet. We get to have a close and personal relationship with God, but we're not with him face to face yet. And so when you inevitably find yourself asking the question, where are you, God? The answer is right here with you, weeping with you, and promising resurrection. Okay, we're going to close there and let's just pray together as we do. Maybe if you're able to stand, why don't you stand? Maybe if the prayer team wants to get ready to come and join us at the front and the band as well. Let's just stay in this moment of focus. God's been moving throughout the service. Let's just ask God what he wants to do in us personally in these last few minutes. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your presence among us this morning, for the work you've been doing already in us. We ask, Father, would you reveal to each one of us now anything you want us to focus on in the next few minutes? You see, as Mary and Martha cried out to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. I believe for some of you here this morning, God's just given you space to come before him, to admit your pain, your loss, your disappointment. It can feel scary to do that, but God doesn't want flowery rehearsed language. He just wants you as you are, real and raw. So tell him about your broken dreams. Tell him about your disappointments. Tell him about your loss. If tears is all you've got for him this morning, that's okay. God sees, he knows what those tears mean. Tell him with your tears, that's okay. But ask him genuinely, where were you, God, in that moment? Where are you, God? For some of you this morning, I believe God's releasing almost that permission to feel deeply, to lament, to passionately express grief or sorrow. I think there's a freedom in this area, breaking down of some of those barriers to doing that. Maybe for some of you, you need to ask God, how do I do that, God? How do I go through life, able to lament, able to let out disappointment and pain? Just ask him now. And I think for some of you, perhaps you've never encountered the God who weeps. Perhaps you've known Jesus for years, but you've never let him come close enough to weep with you, to feel the anger and outrage at the evil of death with you. And I believe there's an invitation to do that. For some of you who are here, you've maybe never met Jesus before. You've never engaged with him personally. You're not really sure who this Jesus is, but he's doing something in you now. There's an opportunity to take a step forward towards him today. Now, if any of these things resonate with you, if you feel God is doing something in you this morning, then why don't you just start now to come down to the front to respond? There's nothing particularly special or weird about being at the front, but as Tim often likes to say, there's sometimes the act of physical obedience brings spiritual breakthrough. There's something about just saying, God, I recognize you're doing something in me, and I'm going to step forward into it. I'm going to engage with it. I'm going to respond to you this morning. So just start to make your way towards the front if that's you. If you feel God is doing something in you. If you just want more of God this morning, if you just want more of God's presence, then come forward. Don't miss the opportunity for someone from our prayer team to just stand with you before God. Yeah, Father, we thank you that when we come before you, you're there. You listen. You're a perfect Father with arms open wide. Thank you that you meet us where we're at, Jesus, in the midst of our pain. And God, we know that you are love. You are good. You are faithful. We praise you, Father, that in Jesus' death and resurrection, we have the hope of one day being with you face to face, where you will personally wipe away every tear from our eye. Help us, Father, to carry this hope as we go.